Hey, friends, welcome back to another episode of Seed Talk with Lisa and Lane. Hey, Lane.
Hello, are you ready to talk about our topic today?
I am because it is one of my favorites. And in fact, I have been known to say I could be a farmer of just this because I just
Mm-hmm.
love them so much. So,
Mm-hmm.
friends, before we jump into our topic today, just reminding you that this broadcast is brought to you and made possible by thegardenersworkshop.com, where you will find all things flowers as well as some veggies thrown
Yes.
in on the side, right? So, friends, be sure to check it out. If you're in the need, we'd love to have you come and visit us over there. So, all right, Lane, lay it on us. What are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to be talking about something that everyone should at least think about doing in their own garden or on their farm. It's a
Yes.
way to cover up bare soil, which is something we really try to avoid having, and it can help to suppress weeds, improve your soil, and even create a habitat for wildlife. And we're talking today about cover cropping. So we're just going to go through a lot of common questions and cover all the basics so you can get an idea of how you can possibly incorporate this into your own farm or garden.
That sounds great. Let's get started.
All right, Lisa. So let's just start with what is cover crop and why is it used? What are some of the benefits of cover cropping?
So there are definitely different benefits, but it's basically a cover crop can be many different types of plants that are just grown to cover the soil, perhaps add nutrients to the soil, perhaps provide habitat. There's a lot of different reasons or different ways to grow them. But basically, the reason they're called a cover crop, they cover the soil. And as you just mentioned, you just never want to leave bare soil. And some of them, you can like, I'm looking at this beautiful image you have of the buckwheat here on the farm. Buckwheat is a quickie, and we often grow that because we can turn it into the soil just in 30 days to add tons of organic matter. So that's a great way to build your soil without bringing in a bunch of finished compost and spreading it and wheelbarrowing it or tractoring or whatever you have to do. And then sometimes cover crops are used to absorb excess nutrients. Then there's habitat for beneficial insects and birds over the winter or during summer. I mean, there's a real mixed bag of opportunities, but we tend to just simplify it and grow it when it's convenient and best for our garden.
Yeah, so lots of potential benefits. And like Lisa mentioned, different crops offer different benefits. So be aware of that as well. But just to give some examples, cover crops can help to cover up bare soil and suppress weeds. They can improve your soil by adding organic matter and nutrients, as well as aeration. They can help prevent soil erosion. There are nitrogen fixing crops like crimson clover. There are even some crops that can provide some tillage in your soil, like the daikon radishes. Those are a great
Right.
one too. And also, you can just see by looking at these images the habitat that this creates for wildlife, especially like the crimson clover. If you're overwintering it and creatures can live in there, and then the flowers come and the pollinators can enjoy them.
That's one of the funnest things that one of the best pastimes that I so enjoy when the any cover crop gets beyond about 8 inches tall is birds, flocks, families, whatever they are, will just come and they just disappear. They land. And, I just imagine them running around and eating bugs and just
Yeah.
having such a great time in there. Yeah, I love cover crop. I could just cover crop.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, really beautiful, but there is a way you can, kind of bring it into your garden and farm, to actually make it part of your garden, not all of your garden.
So, Lisa, is cover cropping just for farmers or should home gardeners consider using it too? Because I think there's this sort of myth or rumor where people think, oh, it's just for farmers.
Right. So the way that most home gardeners and beginner flower farmers kind of maybe test the waters and get discouraged and don't want to do it, it's the selection of which cover crops. I recommend
Right.
for most people to just grow two: buckwheat for warm season or crimson clover for wintering over. And that is because they are really easy to extinguish and to end their run in your garden to go on to plant something else. Some of these others, like this beautiful images that we're looking at here that you have up on the left, is cereal rye, winter cereal rye. That stuff gets over 7 feet tall in my garden, and it has a ferocious root system, which is all great if you have the equipment to handle extinguishing means ending its life, killing it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and if you don't have the proper equipment, you will never get that out of your garden, right? So that would not be a good choice for a home gardener. And then on the right, you have our sunflower cover crop, which that's in our garden last year, I think. So totally beautiful. We loved it for the bees. We just loved it. The bird, and after the bees were done with it, then the finches moved in. I mean, it was really, really a fun thing. But sunflowers are pretty big stalks too. So if you don't have a way to deal with that, it becomes a mess for you. So my first recommendation is when you're getting your feet wet with cover cropping is to go with buckwheat for warm season and cool and crimson clover for cool, both of which you can find over at thegardenersworkshop.com with instructions.
Yeah, and it is really important to consider how easy it is to extinguish, like Lisa mentioned, if you don't have equipment, because it can turn into a real problem. Can you talk
Yep.
about something like sun hemp, Lisa?
Ah, sun hemp. So sun hemp was something I experimented with, and that is not hemp as in what you see everybody talking about now. This is the hemp, the variety of hemp that they make rope out of. So just think about that for a minute. How tough is rope, right? So I bought sun hemp. It's SUNN hemp. And we grew it, and I knew it got this beautiful yellow. It almost looked like an orchid. It's an elongated stem with yellow, beautiful blooms on it. Well, little did I know that you really are supposed to extinguish it when it's only 3 or 4 feet tall, long before it blooms. Well, that stuff, I've got beautiful videos of it. 12 feet tall, those gorgeous blooms, bellow in the wind. I mean, it almost killed our tractor and tiller trying to, I mean, it was mowed, and we just could not. I mean, Steve and I spent hours cleaning our equipment trying to get that hemp rope off of it because I did not do my homework. And that's so I can definitely relate to when those things have happened to people.
And I do think it's the most useful when you have specific beds that maybe they're not in use yet. It could be
Right.
a little, you definitely could incorporate it into the landscape, but you do have to go in and extinguish it somehow, which we'll talk about later. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah. No, and I totally agree. It's like the buckwheat, which is only 30 days from seed to bloom, is perfect to plant in a bed that you just don't have something to plant there yet, or
Yeah.
you just started the seeds inside. Because let me tell you, 30 days goes fast. So, yeah, that's a really good use.
Okay, now we're going to move on to talking about the fact that there are actually warm season and cool season cover crops. Just like we have warm season and cool season flowers and vegetables, the same is true for cover crops. So can you talk about when people should sow these different groups and what are some examples of those different groups of cover
Sure.
crops?
So cool season hardy annuals would be crimson clover, which is the image on the left. And that is winter hardy to a negative 10 degrees, I believe. So if your winter does not go below negative 10, that means you can plant it in the fall to overwinter to keep your soil from being bare, right? And you want to sow it about 6 to 8 weeks before your first expected frost because you want it to sprout and grow into a low cover crop to protect your soil. So that's really a great one. And then for warm season, buckwheat is our go-to. It is a strong grower. I love it because the stems on the plants are hollow like a straw, which means it's really quick and easy to extinguish. And it's so quick to grow. It's really good for helping to suppress weeds. But you know, I tell people that if you're just getting started as a gardener or as a farmer, you don't have to cover crop immediately. That's just something to have in your tool bag that you want to aspire to. And so because you lose time with your bed, you know, to growing flowers or whatever crop you're growing. So don't feel pressured to do it immediately, but keep it in the back of your mind of how would this work into my succession plan.
Since the crimson clover is winter hardy for you, Lisa, do you tend to only plant that in the fall? Have you ever very early spring planted that? I know you don't direct seed in very early spring typically
Right.
due to the cold conditions at that time of year.
Exactly. Very early spring, it's far too cold for it to germinate. So I don't think that'll germinate below 50. So if your very early spring is not 50 or above, the seeds will never sprout. And then if you wait until your spring is there, then the heat is not long behind that and they just never perform to their best. So I would say if you missed your fall opportunity, you just need to put it on your calendar for next year.
And then how about with the buckwheat, since that's a warm season cover crop, when do you tend to start sowing that if you decide you want that in a particular bed?
Sure. So we wait until the soil is definitely nice and warm because the whole problem that most people experience, from what I hear from people, is they don't often sow the seeds into the conditions, whether it's cool or warm, into that seeds, or let's just say buckwheat. If it's too cool outside and you sow the seeds, that seed's just going to sit there and wait for warm conditions. But guess what's not waiting is all the weed seeds. So all of a sudden your cover crop is overpowered, or you have a lot of weeds growing in the canopy. So you want to sow cover crop seeds at the timing that they will get the quickest and fastest and quickest growing germination, and then growing up that you can possibly figure out.
Okay, now we're going to talk about sowing. So, what are some tips for sowing cover crop seeds in general, Lisa?
So I use one of those belly tossers. It's a bag that has a little wheel in the bottom and you turn the handle. Definitely worth the investment of doing that. It just helps you to sow the seeds more evenly. And I make a huge point of sowing seeds when rain is in the forecast, because you can see how long that field is that we're looking at with the buckwheat on the right there. I think that's probably 120-foot long. That's not really an option to water it. I mean, irrigation like we use in our beds is drip tape. It wouldn't work in this application. So if you sow the seeds and it is properly warm, but it doesn't rain, you're going to have the same problem. So you need warm soil with rain on the way, or have a way to water it to really speed up that germination.
And you sow very heavily when you're doing this.
I do. And you can see those track marks or where the tractor, went over it, but you want a thick cover to help with the weed suppression.
Do you tend to do just one type of cover crop in a given bed, or have you ever mixed and matched?
No, I don't. And I resist that for all the reasons that I've mentioned before. It's like, how are you going to extinguish it? How's it perform? There's all kinds of mixes out there for different things, but in a working garden or farm, you need a deadline. It's like maybe not all of it's mature at the same time. You just don't know those things, right? So I stick with straight sowing.
What are some considerations in terms of if you know what's going to be going in that bed following this cover crop? How does that factor into your choice of cover crop?
Sure, that's a good question. So first off, buckwheat is that's warm, the easiest to extinguish. I can almost mow it, till it, and plant the next day. There's very little residue. It just breaks up so nicely, right? But for us as farmers that have equipment, we do grow a lot of winter cereal rye. Well, that has an allopathic effect, meaning it gives off a natural herbicide. So like when it rains and the water runs off the foliage, it prevents many seeds from germinating following that. So, for instance, that's why we grow it. We get great weed control following that. Because we don't direct seed very much on our farm at all, that's not really a problem. So let's just say if you planted winter rye and you were a green bean farmer, and you direct sow all your green beans, it may not germinate following rye, because rye it interferes with that actual sprouting. But because we plant primarily transplants, it's not a problem, but it does help us suppress some weed seed germination. So, there's a lot of different, cover crop can be a real rabbit hole, but I recommend go with buckwheat for summer, crimson clover for fall and for wintering over. Get that under your belt, and then if you want to move on to other things, but we just kind of stick with those two because they're just so easy to incorporate into our program.
One other thing I wanted to mention in terms of crop planning is if you were considering something like sunflower cover crop, for example, you might not want to follow a sunflower cover crop with a sunflower planting. That's another thing to keep in mind.
Sure.
And then always, whenever you're sowing any seed, just be sure that you're meeting the seed's requirements for whether or not it needs to be covered with soil.
Yes. To my knowledge, almost every cover crop seed I know needs to be covered. So the way that we do that, we run over it with a tractor and do shallow tilling, like just an inch deep. But if I was doing it in a garden, you could take a rake, flip it over. You know how the garden rakes are kind of heavier metal type of rakes, turn them over so that the bar is on the soil, and just run over that, and that should create enough cover. But if that seed's not covered, not only will birds eat it, but it will never germinate.
Now we're going to move on to, as we mentioned before, one of the most important considerations for cover crop, which is how and when to actually extinguish the crops. So Lisa, when actually do you know it's time to extinguish a crop? And then can you talk about how on the farm you actually go about extinguishing some of these that we've talked about?
Sure. The best time to extinguish most, and I feel like I want to say all, but you never know what you don't know, right? Time to end a cover crop's use is when it's the most beautiful and in full bloom. That means that it hasn't developed seed yet to become a weedy nuisance, and the vegetation, the stems are fleshy still. They haven't gotten old and tired and hard and tough. So it's the hardest. And the different ways we do it, you can see Steve is bush hogging. That's some crimson clover. Looks like it has some daikon radish in it. I don't know how that happened, but he is bush hogging that. And then this probably was plowed afterwards. Or there's different ways. You can, what they call roll it, which crimps it and bends it over, and that kills it. And then you can tarp it. That takes much longer. It's all about how quick do you need that space is what a lot of it depends on.
So some need equipment and some can be taken care of without any special equipment.
Yes. In a small garden, I mean,
Yeah.
buckwheat, literally, because it's that hollow stem. If you did a little 5x5 area with buckwheat, you could literally pull it out of the ground and lay it down as mulch. I mean, there's just so many great options. Yeah.
How about for someone that has no-till beds? Which cover crops would you recommend for them, and how would you recommend they go about extinguishing the crops in those areas?
Definitely with a silage tarp, we've done lots of that. You can, again, it works best if you roll it with some type of, or mow it to chop it up, then put silage tarps on it, and that helps it to digest. But to just put silage tarps, which is heavy duty black plastic that blocks water, light from getting to everything under there. If you don't do something, the silage tarp is all lumpy, bumpy, and the wind gets under it and just makes it a real maintenance problem. So we either mow it or crimp it. We rarely crimp. It's just a lot more work because we don't have the proper crimping type of equipment. And a silage tarp works really great in a no-till situation.
Obviously, this depends on a lot of different factors, but how soon after you extinguish a cover crop, how soon after that can you typically plant into that bed with some of the ones you've talked about today?
Buckwheat's the quickest, and again, it really depends on how you're extinguishing it and how you're incorporating it, or are you incorporating it. But crimson clover typically is extinguished in April, and we are planting in it in early May. And that's one of the reasons I stick with crimson clover and buckwheat and just really hold to that line of ending them when they're the most beautiful, which is really, really hard, but that makes that possible. So you don't have sticks and tough stems in there that you have to wait to break down. It's all fleshy, nice, fresh foliage. So I think cover cropping can be a really great part of a garden or a flower farm. But I just want to say again, you have to be able to give up space for time, and get the system of your farm going to see, do I have space available that I can give up to cover crops before you dabble. Nothing's more disappointing than that.
And then again, just do investigate for the different crops, what they can do to improve your soil. Like I mentioned, if you want something to help break up your soil, there are options for that. If you want a nitrogen fixing sort of plant that can incorporate some nutrients into your soil, there are options for that. So just be sure to investigate that because it really can be beneficial to your soil.
Yeah, I just love cover cropping. I can see in my retirement years just growing cover crop, all the different ones, and experiment when I'm not on a timeline of planting a working garden, right? Because I mean, and the birds and the pollinators just really love it all.
And it's just so beautiful. A field
Yeah.
of crimson clover. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
Yeah, it is very beautiful. Lane, thanks so much for such a great show today. I love cover crops.
I do too. I love them. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening so you won't miss any of our future episodes. And if you have a favorite cover crop that you like, please feel free to share that over in the comment section on YouTube or using the form linked in the show notes. Or if you'd like to hear us do a full episode about any one of these cover crops, let us know that as well. And just thanks again for joining us.
And friends, you'll find us on the daylight hours over at thegardenersworkshop.com. Till we meet again, friends. Ciao.
Bye.